The morning the king's court arrived at Ashvane Keep, Corwyth Ellandine was the first name struck from the household roster. She heard it before she saw it, the steward's voice cutting through the pre-dawn kitchen like a blade through soft bread. The scullery girl, the tall one, keep her below stairs the whole visit. No sense risking her in front of nobility. No one used her name. They rarely did. In 6 years of service at Ashvane, Corwyth had become something closer to furniture than staff. Present, useful, unremarkable, and therefore safe from the volatile attentions of a household that punished anything that drew notice. She had learned this lesson early, at 14, when a prettier, louder girl named Petra had caught a visiting lord's eye and been dismissed within the week for the crime of being looked at. Corwyth had resolved, from that day, to never be looked at. It had worked for 6 years. She had grown into a tall, quiet woman of 22, brown hair always braided back and pinned flat, hands roughened from lye soap and firewood, eyes that watched everything and revealed nothing. She moved through the keep like a shadow moves through a room, present in every corner, claimed by none. So, when the royal procession thundered up the frozen approach road that morning, banners the colour of dried blood, the wolf-and-crowned sigil of House Threnholt snapping in the wind, Corwyth was already 3 floors below the arriving nobility, arms full of linens, exactly where dismissal had placed her. She told herself this was fortunate. She told herself this every time. The steward, a narrow man named Corwyth Ellandine, who had run Ashvane's household for 2 decades, under a vassal lord too indebted to the crown to refuse this inspection, moved through the halls barking orders, polish the West Hall sconces, air the guest wing, bury anything embarrassing, and keep the scullery girl below stairs. King Baldemar Threnholt did not travel with patience for household disorder, and an unremarkable servant girl underfoot was one more thing that could go wrong. Corwyth didn't mind. She had never seen a king before, not up close, and she suspected she preferred it that way. Kings, in her experience of stories told around the kitchen fire, were either distant and cold or volatile and dangerous. Either way, better viewed from 3 floors down. She spent the morning as she always did, tending fires, hauling water, folding linens that would never touch her own bed, and if her thoughts occasionally wandered up through the stone, toward the sound of boots and voices in the halls above, she did not let them wander for long. By mid-afternoon, the steward sent her below the vassal hall itself, into the old undercroft where the keep's original stores were kept, to retrieve linens that hadn't been needed in a generation, but which the visiting court, apparently, required in excess. It was the kind of task given to someone whose absence would not be noticed, and whose presence would not be missed, which was, Corwyth understood without bitterness, precisely why it had fallen to her. The undercroft was colder than the rest of the keep, lit by a single guttering torch at the base of the stairs. She had been down here perhaps a dozen times in 6 years. It smelled of stone dust and old iron, and at the far end of the passage stood the one thing in Ashvane Keep that every servant had been warned since childhood never to touch: the seal. They called it the Threnholt Dormancy Seal, though most of the household simply called it the Black Door, because that was what it looked like. A disc of black iron easily 8 feet across, set flush into the stone wall at the undercroft's end, inlaid with a pattern of silver ash vine that seemed to shift faintly in torchlight, though everyone agreed that was a trick of the eye and nothing more. The story, as Corwyth had heard it told 100 times, in 100 slightly different versions, was that the first Alpha King of the Threnholt line had sealed something behind that door 319 years ago. No one now living knew precisely what, and warded it with a binding that would open only under one condition: the presence of a bloodline the crown itself could not predict or control, not royal blood, not chosen blood, something the wardens themselves had called resonance, a signature buried in the wolf blood of the old packs that even its bearer might never know they carried. In 3 centuries, nothing had opened it. Nobles visiting Ashvane over the generations had made a minor sport of pressing their palms to the iron, half in genuine hope and half in drunken jest, and the seal had never so much as warmed beneath their touch. Corwyth had never once tried. It had never occurred to her to. She reached the Undercroft storage shelves, gathered the requested linens into her arms, and turned to leave. And it was only because the floor here was uneven, worn smooth and slightly canted by 3 centuries of foot traffic, that her boot caught, and she threw out a hand to catch her balance against the nearest solid surface. That surface was the seal. The sound it made was not loud. It was worse than loud, a single low tone, like a struck bell heard from underwater, that she felt in her sternum more than her ears. The silver ash vine inlay flared white, then settled into a slow, pulsing glow, and the black iron disc, 8 feet of solid metal that had not moved in 319 years, swung inward on a hinge no one had known existed, revealing not a monster, not a hoard of treasure, but a small dark chamber, and within it, nothing at all that Corwyth could immediately make sense of. She stood frozen, linen spilling from her arms onto the stone floor, one hand still raised where she touched the door's frame. Above her, through the Undercroft's thick stone, the tone had been felt as well as heard. Guards posted along the Vassal Hall's lower corridor came down the stairs at a run, swords already drawn, expecting sabotage or assassination. What they found instead was a servant girl standing very still before an open door that had not opened in longer than anyone in the keep had been alive. Word reached the king within minutes. Baldemar Threnholt, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, was 31 years old, and he had spent the entirety of his adult life carrying a burden most of his court did not know existed, the private duty of guarding a seal that in his lifetime and his father's before that had never once answered. He had grown up being told the seal would know its match when it saw it. He had grown into a king half convinced that its match did not exist, that the old warding was a relic of a promise the world had simply outgrown. When his personal guard captain reported the sound and the breach, Baldemar's first assumption was sabotage, some rival house testing century-old wards for a weakness they could exploit. He descended to the Undercroft himself, flanked by guards, prepared for confrontation. He found a servant girl instead. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in the plain wool of household staff, and she had not moved from the spot where the seal's opening had rooted her. When she saw him, saw the wolfen crown embroidered at his collar, saw the way every guard in the room deferred to him without needing to be told, she went very still, in the particular way people go still when they expect to be blamed for something they don't understand. "I didn't touch it on purpose," she said, before he'd spoken a word. "My boot caught. I put my hand out. I didn't know. I've worked here 6 years. I've never so much as looked at it twice." "Your name," Baldemar said. Not unkindly, just direct, the way a man speaks when he is trying to hold very still himself. Corwyth Ellandine." He looked at her the way, she would realize much later, no one at Ashvane had ever looked at her before. Not past her, not through her, not around her towards someone more worth noticing. He looked directly at her, as though she were the only person standing in the room, and something in his expression shifted from wariness into something far more complicated. "Corwyth Ellandine," he repeated quietly, as if testing whether the name itself carried weight. "Has anyone in your family ever spoken of wolf blood? Of the old packs?" "No, my lord, my king. I don't know my parents. I was raised in the keep's care from infancy." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the open seal behind her, the pulsing silver ash vine, the small dark chamber it revealed. Then he turned back to her with an expression she couldn't yet read. "Then we have a great deal to discuss," he said. "And you are not going back to the scullery tonight," she protested. Of course she protested. 6 years of training herself to be unremarkable did not undo itself because a king said otherwise. But protest availed her nothing against the plain fact that the seal had opened for the first time in 319 years, and it had opened for her, and a king who had spent his life guarding a mystery he half believed was hollow was not about to let its answer walk back to the scullery. That evening, in a guest chamber larger than any room Corwyth had ever slept in, with 2 guards posted outside the door. For security, Baldemar insisted, though she suspected it was also so she wouldn't slip away in the night. He explained what he could. The seal, he told her, had never responded to rank or wealth or claimed bloodline, no matter how many nobles across 3 centuries had pressed hopeful palms against it. The wardens who built it had left records, fragmentary, incomplete, but consistent, describing what they called resonance, a wolf blood signature that could lie dormant in a person's line for generations, entirely unknown even to its bearer, surfacing only when it came near enough to the one thing capable of waking it. "Near enough to what?" Corwyth asked. Baldemar didn't answer that directly. Instead he said, "You have never shown any sign of it. No shift, no strength beyond ordinary, nothing that would mark you as anything but human. Because I am human, as far as I've ever known. As far as either of us knew, this morning," he said, "the seal was inert stone." She had no argument for that. She had never asked about her parents, because there had never been anyone left to ask, and because a scullery girl learning she might be something other than ordinary was, in her experience of the world, more often a danger than a gift. Over the following days, Baldemar had scholars brought from the capital's archive to examine the seal's chamber and cross-reference the old warden texts. What they found was maddeningly incomplete. 3 centuries of records reduced, by fire and neglect, to fragments that spoke of resonance, without ever fully explaining its mechanism. What was clear, though, was this. The seal had been built not as a prison for a monster, as legend assumed, but as a threshold, a door meant to open only when the right person stood before it, for reasons the original wardens had apparently considered too dangerous or too sacred to write plainly. They wanted to make sure whoever inherited this couldn't simply hand it to anyone convenient, one of the scholars explained. A door that opens for rank can be bribed, coerced, forced. A door that opens for something a person cannot fake, cannot inherit deliberately, cannot even know they carry. That door can never be corrupted by ambition. Baldemar absorbed this in silence, and Corwyth, listening from the edge of the room where she still instinctively positioned herself, understood before he said anything aloud that this changed the shape of what was happening between them. She was not simply a curiosity the seal had produced. She was, by design 3 centuries old, the one thing in the kingdom that could not have been arranged, purchased, or falsified. The weeks that followed reshaped Corwyth's understanding of the keep she had lived in for 6 years without truly seeing. Baldemar kept her near under the official reasoning of seal security. The warden's old texts needed translating. The chamber behind the door needed careful study. And the one person the seal had responded to was, by every logical measure, essential to that work. It was a reasonable pretext. It was also, both of them understood without saying so aloud, not the whole truth. She began attending small portions of his council sessions, ostensibly to be available should questions about the seal arise. What she found instead was a kingdom's worth of quiet exhaustion sitting behind the king's composed exterior, a court of advisers who flattered more than they counselled, treasury reports that didn't add cleanly, a northern border garrison that hadn't been properly resupplied in 2 seasons because someone along the chain of command was skimming the difference. She noticed these things the way she had always noticed things, quietly, without announcing it, filing each observation away as a matter of habit rather than ambition. But when, 3 weeks in, she mentioned offhand that the garrison requisitions looked short by roughly a fifth compared to the Treasury's own ledger, Boldemar sat back in his chair and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the Undercroft, as though she were the only person in the room worth attending to. "How long have you been reading my Treasury ledgers?" he asked. "You left them open on the table. I wasn't reading them on purpose. I just noticed. 6 years in a scullery, and you noticed discrepancies in royal requisition ledgers at a glance." "6 years of being ignored teaches you to watch everything," she said, "since no one's watching you back." He didn't have a response to that. He simply sat with it, and something in his expression, some old, guarded weight he carried, eased fractionally, as though being seen so plainly by someone who wanted nothing from him was a relief he hadn't known he needed. Their closeness deepened in small, unhurried increments, exactly the way real things tend to, rather than the sudden way stories claimed. A shared meal after a council session that had gone badly, where he said almost nothing and she simply sat with him rather than filling the silence with noise. A walk along the ramparts on a clear, cold evening, where she finally spoke without the careful flatness she'd cultivated for 6 years, telling him, because he asked, and because for once someone asking felt like genuine curiosity rather than a trap, about the pretty, loud girl named Petra, who'd been dismissed for the crime of being noticed, and how Corwyth had spent every year since trying not to repeat her mistake. "You've spent 6 years trying to disappear," Boldemar said when she finished, "and the one door in this kingdom that hasn't opened in 3 centuries chose the exact moment you touched it, by accident, to finally answer. Maybe it made a mistake." "I don't think it did," he said. "I think it's been waiting for exactly this long, because it does not answer to anyone performing significance. It answers to the real thing, and you are the first real thing that has stood in front of it in 319 years. She didn't have an answer for that either. She only knew that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, being looked at directly did not feel like danger. There were nights she stayed near him, not because guards required it or duty demanded it, but because she chose to, sitting across from him while he worked through reports too late into the evening, saying little, simply present in a way that asked nothing of him except that he not be alone with it. He, in turn, began seeking her out for reasons that had less and less to do with the seal, and more to do with the plain fact that her company had become something he wanted, rather than something assigned to him. One evening, after a particularly difficult session with a border lord who had come close to open insult, Boldemar found her in the small library off the guest wing, and instead of retreating to his own chambers to sit with his frustration alone, as he had done for years, he sat across from her and simply talked, about the weight of a crown he'd inherited too young, about a father whose expectations he'd never quite escaped even in death, about the quiet fear that he was ruling a kingdom that respected his title more than they trusted the man wearing it. Corwyth listened without offering easy reassurance, which he found, to his own surprise, more comforting than reassurance would have been. "You don't need them to trust you blindly," she said eventually. "You need them to see you clearly enough that trust becomes obvious. That's different." "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Saying the thing I needed to hear without seeming to notice you've said anything remarkable at all." She smiled faintly, the first unguarded smile he'd seen from her. 6 years of practice not being noticed. I suppose I never learned to notice myself either. Neither of them named what was growing between them yet. But it was there, quiet and steady, the way real things tend to be. Not everyone in the keep welcomed this development. Lord Regent Casvion Threnholt, Baldemar's cousin, had spent the better part of a decade carefully positioning himself as heir presumptive, against the possibility that the king might never take a mate, might never produce an heir of his own line, might die and leave the throne without clear succession. It was patient, careful work, cultivating loyal allies among the border lords, ensuring his name was spoken in the same breath as continuity and stability, waiting. A servant girl suddenly elevated by an ancient seal's unprecedented answer was not part of that plan. Worse, from Casvion's perspective, was how quickly the king's attention had fixed on her, not as a curiosity to be studied and set aside, but as someone he sought out, consulted, and increasingly seemed unwilling to be without. Casvion moved the way patient men move, quietly, indirectly, through others. Rumors began circulating among the court within weeks that the servant girl had somehow tricked or forced the seal open through some hidden mechanism, that her sudden significance was too convenient to be genuine, that the king was being manipulated by a clever opportunist who had spent 6 years in his household, waiting for precisely this chance. When rumor alone failed to dislodge her, Casvion escalated. A valuable ceremonial item went missing from the vassal hall's strongroom, a minor relic, easily replaceable, but chosen specifically because its disappearance could be traced, with sufficiently motivated testimony, back to the one servant with unusual and unsupervised access to the keep's oldest chambers. 2 witnesses, both quietly indebted to Casvion in ways that would never appear in any ledger, were prepared to swear they'd seen Corwyth near the strongroom the night of the theft. Baldemar intervened before the accusation reached a formal hearing. A single conversation with the captain of the guard, a single pointed question about who exactly had access to the strongroom's second key, was enough to unravel the fabrication before it gained momentum. But the attempt itself clarified something neither of them could ignore. Corwyth was no longer safe, simply because she had once been beneath notice. That protection, the only protection she had ever known, was gone. She was visible now, and visibility, in a court hungry for succession and threatened by uncertainty, made her a target. She sat with that reality for 2 days, largely in silence, weighing, as she had weighed every risk in her adult life, whether the safest course was to withdraw, to ask Baldemar to release her from the keep's attention entirely, and let her disappear into some quiet, unremarkable corner of the kingdom where Casvion's schemes could not reach her. It would have been the choice her 6 years of training had prepared her to make. She did not make it. I spent 6 years disappearing because I believed it kept me safe, she told Baldemar on the evening she finally spoke her decision aloud. But it didn't keep me safe. It only kept me small. I don't know what I am to that seal, or to you, or to this kingdom. But I know I'm done making myself smaller because someone else finds me inconvenient. If you stay, Baldemar said, Casvion won't stop. He'll find another angle. The next one may not unravel so easily. Then we'll unravel the next one too, she said. I'm not asking you to protect me from every risk. I'm telling you I'm choosing to stand here anyway. Baldemar studied her for a long moment. This woman, who had spent 6 years perfecting invisibility and was now, deliberately, choosing its opposite. And something in his chest settled into certainty. Then we face it together, he said. Not because you need my protection, because I want to stand where you're standing. 2 weeks later, in Ashvane's old chapel, chosen deliberately for its age and its neutrality, a space that belonged to no faction and answered to no regent's ambitions, Baldemar named her formally before witnesses Casvion could not silence or bribe into absence. Border lords, the garrison captain whose supply shortage Corwyth had first noticed, household staff who had known her for 6 years without ever truly seeing her. He did not name her as a servant elevated by fortune, nor as a curiosity the seal had produced. He named her as the bonded match the ancient warding itself had recognized, the resonance the wardens had written of 3 centuries past, finally answered, finally real. Corwyth Ellandine, who had spent 6 years being the first name struck from every roster, who had trained herself since 14 to be unremarkable and safe, stood at the center of a chapel full of witnesses, and was, for the first time in her life, seen completely, and was not dismissed. Ashvane, present among the witnesses because his absence would have been its own confession, said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The rumors he had spread could not survive a formal naming, witnessed by border lords with no reason to lie on his behalf. The stolen relic, recovered days earlier when the guard captain's quiet investigation finally traced it to its true location, further eroded whatever credibility his accusations had briefly held. His careful decade of positioning had not accounted for a servant girl's boot-catching on uneven stone. That night, in the private quiet of the king's chambers, the formality of the chapel fell away, and what remained between them was simpler and far more theirs alone. There was no performance in it, no ceremony left to observe. Boldemar's hand found hers first, quietly, the way a question is asked without needing words. She answered by not pulling away. They sat together for a long while, in a silence that asked nothing of either of them. 2 people who had each spent years being unseen in different ways, he by the weight of a crown that demanded constant composure, she by 6 years of deliberate smallness, both of them finally choosing, in this one room, to be seen only by each other. When he finally drew her closer, it was unhurried, a slow, careful gentleness, as though he were memorizing the moment rather than rushing through it. She let herself lean into it, let herself want it plainly, without the old reflex to make herself smaller, or quieter, or less present. His hand traced along her jaw, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and safely visible. Nothing about the night was hurried or performative. It was tender, patient, built from the same quiet trust that had grown between them over the preceding weeks, a closeness earned in council chambers and along cold ramparts, in shared silences and small confessions, long before it ever became anything more. What passed between them that night stayed gentle and unspoken in its particulars, the way the truest things often do, known fully only to the 2 of them. In the morning, she woke before he did, and for a long moment simply watched the quiet, unguarded stillness of his sleeping face, a stillness she suspected almost no one else in the kingdom had ever been permitted to witness. When he woke and found her watching him, he didn't ask why. He only reached for her hand again, as though the gesture from the night before had become something neither of them intended to stop doing. In the seasons that followed, Ashvane's decade of careful positioning collapsed under the weight of its own dishonesty. Without the servant girl to blame, without rumors that could survive scrutiny, his allies among the border lords quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a regent whose ambitions had curdled into fabricated accusations against an innocent woman. He retained his title, stripped of influence, a cautionary footnote in a court that had chosen, in the end, to trust the evidence over the whispering. The seal in Ashvane's undercroft remained open, its chamber slowly studied by scholars Boldemar commissioned from across the kingdom, though what lay within, small, quiet, unremarkable at first glance, much like the woman who had opened it, would take years yet to fully understand. What the scholars did conclude, eventually, was simpler than any of them had expected. The chamber had never held a monster or a treasure. It had held a record, genealogies of the old packs, painstakingly preserved by wardens who understood that bloodlines could be lost to history unless something forced their rediscovery. Among those records, faded but legible, was a lineage that traced, improbably and unmistakably, back to Corwyth's own long-forgotten family, a minor branch of the old pack nobility, scattered and lost generations before her birth, its last remnant abandoned as an infant at Ashvane's gates in circumstances no one now living could fully explain. She was not, as it turned out, an accident the seal had simply happened to notice. She was the last thread of a bloodline it had been quietly waiting 3 centuries to find. Corwyth Ellandine, who had once been the first name struck from every roster in a household that valued her only for her absence, became instead the first name spoken in every account of that year, not because she had sought significance, but because she had finally stopped making herself small enough to avoid it. She ruled beside Boldemar, not as an ornament to his crown, but as the one person in his life who had earned his trust by seeing him clearly, long before either of them understood what the seal had truly recognized in her. The garrison she'd flagged was resupplied within the month, its skimming officer quietly removed. The household staff, who had spent 6 years overlooking her, found, to their quiet astonishment, that she remembered every one of their names in return, and treated them with a consideration the keep's nobility rarely extended to servants. And in the keep that had once dismissed her without a second glance, on the very morning her name had been struck from a roster before the sun had fully risen, she found, at last, the one place she never had to disappear again.